Hello and welcome. I'm Katie Blankenau, a visiting assistant professor at Northwestern University, where I specialize in 16th and 17th century English drama. Today, I'll be discussing Chicago Shakespeare's audio productions of Twelfth Night and Measure for Measure. And this talk is part of the Preamble program, which is presented by the John W. and Jean M. Rowe Inquiry and Exploration series. By this point, post-pandemic, we've become accustomed to digital alternatives to pre-pandemic life. We bounce from Zoom to Netflix, relying on the 21st century technologies that characterize this brave new world. The productions of Twelfth Night and Measure for Measure that you'll be hearing are rooted in our current moment. But I'd like to start this talk by putting these audio plays within an older technological and artistic tradition, radio drama. I'll begin then by briefly exploring the beginnings of Shakespearean radio with some of the problems and possibilities that audio plays pose, as well as the ways they resonate with Elizabethan theater. And then we'll turn to the plays themselves, considering the ways in which they speak to each other and what stands out to me about these audio adaptations, especially in relation to questions about Shakespeare and sound. As we go, I'd like to keep in mind a description of radio drama by the British playwright David Pownall, who has written a number of radio plays. Pownall argues that audio drama has, he says, a unique character stripped down to the music of syllables and the business of understanding. I find those phrases, the music of syllables and the business of understanding, especially provocative in the case of these two productions. For me, Pownall's description captures the way that audio productions bring out the musicality of Shakespearean sound and challenge the audience to connect with the characters, to understand them through complex and rewarding imaginative engagement. So, with that in mind, let's turn to the beginning of Shakespearean radio drama at the BBC. The BBC, or British Broadcasting Company, made its first foray into radio drama with a scene from Julius Caesar, which was broadcast in February 1923. And we might think that immediately this promised a new kind of accessibility in Shakespearean theater. London's very famous West End theaters could now broadcast their performances across the country. So a farmer in Yorkshire could listen to a production from a London stage. But the reality was more complicated. The theater establishment actually felt threatened by this new medium. And within 3 months of that first broadcast, the theater had forbidden the BBC to transmit recordings of live theatrical shows. This left the BBC strapped for content, and they were already short of cash. So in response, in May of 1923, the BBC broadcast its first full-length radio play, produced within its own studio. The play in question was Twelfth Night. We don't have any recordings that survive of that production, but it was a huge success, in part because it was accessible to anyone with a radio, and in part because it was a refreshing escape from the overcrowded stages and over-elaborate scenery that had become popular in theaters at that time. But while in some respects, radio drama represented an improvement over early 20th century theatrical trends, it had its own problems. Shakespeare's plays, after all, were written for the stage, not the studio. And on the 75th anniversary of that first Twelfth Night performance, the BBC actually produced a radio play by Pownall, who I mentioned earlier. The play is about the making of that 1923 Twelfth Night and depicts the director and the actors struggling to figure out how to make Shakespeare for radio. In particular, they struggle with Twelfth Night's comic highlight, The appearance of the Puritan steward Malvolio, ridiculously dressed up in garish yellow stockings with elaborate garters. How can a visual joke like that translate to an audio medium? This radio play highlights the challenges that directors, sound artists, and actors face in creating Shakespeare specifically for radio. The early BBC performers were, in effect, experimenting with a new kind of theater, a theater of sound. So, what happens then when a play is heard rather than heard and seen? How does that change the relationships between the audiences, the story, and the performers? I mentioned that in the early days of the BBC, there's a conflict between the theater business and the radio. But tension between notions of the play as something we see or as something we hear, that tension actually goes back even further to the theater scene in Shakespeare's day. In the 16th and 17th centuries, there was some debate over whether the people who attend a play should be called spectators or the audience. If we think about it, the two terms emphasize two distinct aspects of playgoing. The word audience comes from the Latin for hearing, while spectators comes from the Latin for watching. Some playwrights, in particular Shakespeare's contemporary, Ben Jonson, insisted that hearing a play was more important than seeing it. And this distinction was crucial to Jonson, especially, because he wanted people to listen to his words rather than watch the actors. He saw his words as more valuable than their performances, and he didn't hesitate to say so. The prologue to one of his plays laments to the audience, "Would you were come to hear, not see a play?" He scolded spectators who were interested only in shows, arguing that the play was about the poetry. And in a sense, we've never actually resolved the question of whether plays are meant to be seen or heard. We call ourselves the audience, but we say we're going to see a play. Of course, as even Jonson had to have known, the joy of theater is that it engages both senses and adds to them the excitement and the energy generated by the give and take between performers and audience. That give and take in a shared space and shared moment of time is lost in a recorded audio play. There's simply no way to remedy that loss. But Jonson, I believe, was wrong. The words aren't everything. Yet, and I think this is the crucial point, audio plays are more than just words. For every director, from the early BBC radio experimenters to Barbara Gaines, the director of Twelfth Night, and Henry Godinez, the director of Measure for Measure, for every director, the goal of audio drama is to produce more than just a reading of the play. Readings can obviously be illuminating. I have nothing against audiobooks, but they're not audio drama. An audio drama incorporates all the complexity of a regular theatrical production. Actors must inhabit their roles. The director must conceive a particular vision for the play. And artists, in this case, sound artists, build the scaffolding of the play's setting. But audio drama has an added complexity and an additional contributor, the audience, who have to create the world and the action of the play in their own heads. Pownall's insight, I think, is again useful here. I mentioned that the creative energy that occurs between the performers and a live audience gets lost in a recorded audio play. But Pownall suggests that a different connection is formed. He argues that when a radio play succeeds, the connection between playwright and listener has been charged with the energy of two imaginations sharing the same scenes and action and characters. When we hear an audio play, we build and populate the world with our own imaginations. We take on a part of the playwright's work. We share scenes with Shakespeare, and that's an exciting thing. I think the reason that Shakespeare works so well as audio drama is not that the words are especially well written or that the worlds are particularly well built, although they are, but that this hunger for the audience's imaginative collaboration was central to Shakespeare's idea of the theater. I mentioned that Jonson wanted the audience to listen. Shakespeare, in the famous prologue to Henry V, calls on the audience to imagine and build. He writes, "'Tis your thoughts that now must deck our kings." In audio drama, we do this. We don't just watch the story play out, we deck the stage ourselves, with, of course, a lot of help and inspiration from the creative teams and the performers. Earlier, I mentioned the idea that audio drama is about the music of syllables and the business of understanding. The business of understanding is another way of describing what we as auditors do in audio drama. We can interpret business as meaning work, the imaginative labor that we have to do in order to understand the story. But we can also think of business as relating to stage business, the theatrical term for all the little actions and movements that actors do on stage to help flesh out their characters as living in a world. For me, the audio drama replaces this kind of visual stage business with a more visceral business of understanding. The actor is speaking right into our ear. The character is calling out to us to understand in order to, in a way, see them as individuals with complex needs and desires. Unless they're Sir Andrew in Twelfth Night, then their needs and desires are not so complex. I'd like to turn then to Twelfth Night and Measure for Measure and explore what these particular productions are able to do with the music of syllables and the business of understanding. Let's start with Twelfth Night and consider how this production, directed by Barbara Gaines, grapples with those problems that the first radio Twelfth Night faced in 1923. How do you turn a play that seems reliant on visual comedy into an audio drama? Twelfth Night is one of Shakespeare's late comedies. It was written for a court performance on Twelfth Night, the last day of the Christmas season. In the play, Shakespeare repurposes some of his most successful ploys from earlier comedies. He uses the mixed up twins in the Comedy of Errors and the trick of a boy actor playing a girl, playing a boy from Two Gentlemen of Verona and As You Like It. In Twelfth Night, the lead character, played by Lakeisha Renee, is a young woman who has survived a shipwreck in which she thinks her twin brother, Sebastian, has drowned. She is grieving and alone in Illyria, an unfamiliar country. So she disguises herself as a boy named Cesario and finds work at the court of the Duke Orsino. Spoiler alert, however, her twin brother is not dead, and chaos ensues when what seems to be one very attractive boy is actually two different people, each embroiled in their own complicated love affairs. This story then would seem to be all about visual jokes and mix-ups. For me, though, this audio production shows how much Shakespeare uses the music of syllables rather than visual likeness to connect the characters. The play's antagonist of sorts is a man named Malvolio. He is the steward to the Lady Olivia, who is grieving the death of her father and brother, and will have nothing to do with men, particularly her neighbor, Duke Orsino. And at the beginning of the play, Orsino is wallowing in his unreciprocated love for Olivia. Malvolio is representative of the mood at Olivia's house when the play begins. Stiffly formal, withdrawn, repressed. One character suggests that Malvolio is a Puritan, He certainly disapproves of the drunken partying of Olivia's uncle, Sir Toby, and his friend, Sir Andrew. Already, you've probably heard the connection I've suggested earlier. The syllables of these characters' names, Olivia, Malvolio, sound like echoes and remixes of one another. And then, at the very end of the play, we finally hear Cesario's real name. She is Viola. Viola, Olivia, Malvolio. Together, their names make a kind of music, the way that their characters reflect on each other in varying ways. Viola and Olivia have lost brothers. Olivia and Malvolio have lost their senses of joy and playfulness. Throughout the play, all three of them fall in love, with varying results. The song that opens this production tells us that the theme of the night is love, and that song leads into the famous first line of Twelfth Night, "If music be the food of love, play on." This play has some of my favorite and I think the best songs by Shakespeare. Surprisingly, though, a lot of productions have downplayed the music, cutting most of the songs except for the one that ends the play. For me, one of the most exciting things about this audio play is that it emphasizes how crucial music is to Twelfth Night. Not only the music of syllables, but music itself. The music in this production is composed by Jariah Kwame, who's also written music and lyrics for 2 additional songs. So rather than cut songs, this production adds them, taking full advantage of the audio medium. And Kwame's music, I think, brings out the tonal contrast of this play, its blend of playfulness and joy with melancholy. And nowhere is that contrast more evident than in the character of Festy the Fool. He's played here by Paul Oakley Stovall. Festy is Olivia's fool. His name means feast or celebration. He's been absent for some time, and he won't tell anyone why or where he's been. And he's not initially welcomed back, as you'll see. Olivia is angry with him, and Malvolio despises him. Jariah Kwame introduces Festy with a song, asking a question that Shakespeare implicitly raises. Why has the fool returned? I'd encourage you to listen closely, because the song and Stovall's performance help establish who Festy is, and the delicate line that he walks as a performer who brings laughter, but also tells the truth. In Twelfth Night, Paul Oakley Stovall plays Festy as wry and warm, and he takes really full advantage of his wide vocal range. And Festy, as I said, is a truth teller. In Measure for Measure, though, Stovall plays Lucio, a rather disreputable character who has quite a bit to say about the Duke, the play's political reader, whom he calls the Duke of Dark Corners. It's not clear whether or not Lucio is speaking the truth. And Stovall sings in this play as well, but only on entrances or exits, and always softly. For me, this speaks to the ways in which Measure for Measure contrasts with Twelfth Night. Whereas Twelfth Night pits emotional repression and grief against the forces of desire and music, Measure for Measure pits religion and political oppression against corruption and the sex trade. That's a much more complicated state of affairs. And in fact, if we look at the casting, we can think of Measure for Measure as a kind of topsy-turvy version of the previous play. Larry Yando, who plays the uptight Malvolio in Twelfth Night, plays Pompey, a pimp, in Measure for Measure. Monica Orozco, who plays Olivia in Twelfth Night, in Measure for Measure, plays Mistress Overdone, a madam. So, as you might expect, the sex trade is a key part of the world of Measure for Measure. But that world has been shifted from the setting of the original play, which takes place in Vienna. The director, Harry Godinez, who's Cuban American, has set this production in Havana. More specifically, it's set on the eve of Fidel Castro's rise to power. Castro's regime was supposed to put an end to the systemic racism and poverty that had forced many women in Havana into the sex work. But he ultimately failed to deliver. And that makes for what I find a very powerful alignment with the plot of Measure for Measure. In this play, the city's ruler, a duke, takes a sort of leave of absence from his reign and puts a man named Angelo in charge. Angelo is known to be zealously pure, free from the temptations of sex and corruption. Implicitly, the Duke doesn't seem to want to take the blame for enforcing laws forbidding sex outside of marriage. And he hopes that the incorruptible Angelo will take care of that for him. Meanwhile, the Duke disguises himself as a friar to observe the sexual politics that ensue and to stage manage the fallout. And while this production is an audio play, unlike Twelfth Night, it has visual art that accompanies it. The video design is by Devontae Johnson, and it puts us and the actors in Havana. The video design has, I think, been very carefully balanced. It allows us to briefly see the actors in character. And this is really important, I think, in the context of the racial politics that the setting evokes. It matters, I think, that the Duke is played by Kevin Goodall, who's white, and the man he sets up to take the fall, Angelo, is played by James Vincent Meredith, who's Black. The video design also presents backdrops that evoke both location and mood. In one prison scene, for example, we see images of men in cells, as well as a smaller echo of the same prison cells on the face of the Duke, prompting us, I think, to consider the Duke's very ambiguous relationship to law and to what passes for justice. Importantly, though, the visual design doesn't take us out of the essential audio nature of the play. We still construct this audio play ourselves. And I think this play is especially suited to audio drama because it hinges on what we've been calling the business of understanding. Angelo, in the Duke's absence, is called on to judge the case of Claudio, who has gotten his girlfriend pregnant. The play is very clear that their relationship is consensual, or in the play's word, mutual. But Claudio is nonetheless sentenced to death. From jail, he sends word to his sister, Isabel, played by Cruz Gonzalez Cadell. And Isabel is about to take her vows to enter a convent, but she pauses in order to go before Angelo and plead for mercy for her brother. Isabel presents a brilliant, evocative argument for mercy, which culminates in a request. "Go to your bosom," she tells Angelo, "knock there, and ask your heart what it doth know that's like my brother's fault." Isabel's plea reminds us that the business of understanding doesn't just involve the ear, it also involves the heart. To understand, we have to listen and self-reflect. But Angelo seems never to have been tempted to commit Claudio's crime and cannot use his imagination to imagine Claudio's motivations and feelings. He can't even create a sort of character, an alternate version of himself who might have done the same in order to understand Claudio. Angelo is a very bad audience member. So bad, in fact, that he begins to lust after Isabel as she pleads rather than listening to her. Ultimately, he demands sex in exchange for her brother's life. And when she threatens to expose him, he asks her a simple question: "Who will believe thee, Isabel?" It's an old question and a familiar one that after the Me Too movement, our society is slowly beginning to reckon with. Isabel knows that Angelo is right. To whom should I complain? She asks. As audience members, though, we can hear her complaints, and we can also try to understand her, taking into consideration her deep religious convictions and asking ourselves what we would do in her position or in Claudio's. And in fact, both Twelfth Night and Measure for Measure ask us to think about the power of a woman's voice. In each play, a woman becomes an advocate. Viola advocates on Orsino's behalf to Olivia, and Isabel advocates for her brother's life. In each case, without the speaker intending it, the listener falls in love or lust with the woman who speaks. The juxtaposition of these two plays, I think, asks us to consider the ways in which advocacy is for women both powerful and dangerous. Crucially, at the end of Measure for Measure, Isabel is silent. In response to a life-altering announcement by the Duke, she says nothing. And that silence echoes over the end of the play, forcing directors and actors to decide how to stage it. Her silence has sometimes been taken to mean consent, in order to give the play an ambiguous and happy ending. But I would argue that listening to an audio play exposes that kind of staged ending as false. When a character in an audio play is silent, it's as if they aren't there. We hear nothing. And we can more easily understand this not as a silence implying consent, but as a silencing of her character. In this production, the video provides an additional layer. We see an ambiguous exchange between Isabel and another character who is silent at the play's conclusion, a prisoner named Barnardine. Here, I think the director, Godinez, is suggesting their future resistance to the power that silences them, and opening up a new way to think about the ending of the play, particularly in the context of racism and sexism in Cuba. So, having started this talk with sound, we've ended up thinking about silence. That's probably my cue to leave you to enjoy these productions. I hope you find that while hearing a play is very different than seeing one, it's no less rewarding. Thank you for listening.